Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for February 14th, 2023. Well, if you think things have been wild with the U.S. Air Force chasing balloons and other unidentified flying objects all over U.S. airspace, buckle your seatbelts because it's about to get much more wild. The question that I'm going to address today is, are the U.S. unilateralist war hawks preparing for terrorist strikes inside Russia to further their goal of regime change? Now, one function of psychological warfare is to create an environment in which a population becomes accustomed to the idea that you need to just duck your head. War is inevitable. There's nothing you can do about it. And this is facilitated by building an enemy image, for example, of Russian soldiers as rapists, Putin as a new Hitler, or the idea of China flooding American airspace with spy balloons and ignoring the fact that we're continuing to have massive spying on Americans conducted by our own government. Now, all of this is used to justify huge expenditures on military, as well as the buildup for a war. Now, don't forget the role in this of a compliant media, which allows the censorship of truth and the spreading of lies. For example, what we've learned from the Twitter files about the FBI role in censoring social media, or the Columbia Journalist Review, which has a lengthy article on the consistent lying of Russiagate in the media, or the blacking out of the Seymour Hersh article on the U.S. role in blowing up the Nord Stream pipelines. Now something's coming to light which is of probably more danger and a serious escalation. This comes from a news item sent out by the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, which issued a travel advisory warning American tourists and residents to leave Russia. Now, among the reasons they give is their assessment that, quote, terrorist groups, both transnational and local, are planning to strike with little or no warning, to strike tourist locations, transportation hubs and systems, markets and shopping malls, local government facilities, hotels, clubs, restaurants, places of worship, parks, major sporting and cultural events, educational institutions, airports, and other public areas in Russia, basically targeting the whole country. Now, this is a warning from the U.S. State Department. Later in the day, there was a news item from the Russians. The presidential spokesman Peskov said that Russian intelligence services have advised that, quote, the United States is planning to send militants into Russia, unquote. And what TASS then reports is that the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service said there are specific reports of 60 ISIS and Al Qaeda affiliated terrorists that have been recruited from the Middle East theater, where the U.S. still maintains operations, for a crash course in making and using improvised explosive devices, sabotage, etc., at the illegally established U.S. Entente military base in Syria. And they are then to be infiltrated into Russia in small groups. Now, do you think this is Russian disinformation? Well, keep in mind, the first warning is from the U.S. Embassy. That is the State Department. The second point, though, is, have you forgotten what the U.S. has been engaged in the name of regime change and color revolution? The arming and training of mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Well-documented facts that the arms and training went to groups that later became Taliban, that is the local Afghan militia, and the Saudi directed militia became Al Qaeda from Afghanistan, all backed and trained by the United States. What about the lies of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq to justify regime change against Saddam Hussein? And the regime change took the form there of a war. But at the same time, in the prison camps, ISIS was created. And these were prison camps run by the Americans. How about the arming and training of ISIS and Al Qaeda in Syria to carry out regime change against the Assad government? And this was reported, among others, by General Michael Flynn, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And the U.S. is still holding territory in Syria, and this is what the Russians point to as a training base for potential terrorists to be deployed into Russia. What about the U.S. sponsorship of neo-Nazi battalions in Ukraine that became the Azov Battalion inside the Ukraine Defense and Security Forces that were engaged in the shooting at both police and demonstrators in the Maidan Square to foment and carry out the coup against the democratically elected Yanukovych government? And what was the Ukraine regime change aimed at? Russia. And then, of course, you have coups and counter-coups regularly in Africa, in South America, in Asia. Anytime a government steps out of line, steps away from the neoliberal policies enforced by the International Monetary Fund, they have to deal with U.S. military and NATO forces. So this is not Russian disinformation. This is a serious threat on top of the discussion underway about escalating the arms trafficking into Ukraine. Now, why is this done? It's all done allegedly in defense of our Western values, our democratic values. This is what Zelensky said when he was in London and Paris, that we, the Ukrainians, are fighting for your Western values, which is, of course, a fraud. But that's the line that's put out by the European Union, NATO, Biden, the idea of democracy versus authoritarianism. So let's just ask this question. Do these values include continuing murderous sanctions against Syria, where families whose lives have been destroyed by the earthquake can't get aid because of U.S. sanctions? Do these values include the suffering of children imposed in Afghanistan, Yemen, and elsewhere by U.S. sanctions? Do these values include blowing up pipelines that provide cheap energy to heat homes and allow for transportation in Germany, an ally of the United States? The destruction of these pipelines leading to soaring prices, to deindustrialization of the industrial engine of Europe? And do these values include the wrecking of the future of young people in Asia, in Africa, in South America, by forcing them to accept International Monetary Fund conditionalities and fraudulent green policies? This is why there's a rebellion of the Global South. This is why the Western countries have not been able to get support from the Southern Hemisphere for their operations against Russia. It's not Russian disinformation, it's US and European NATO policy, which is causing nations to turn against the West. And as the Financial Times reports, this is leading to a growing weakness of the US dollar as we're seeing moves towards new financial arrangements, including national currencies, regional currencies, and other forms of trade and investment outside of the control of the City of London and Wall Street. So this is not Russian disinformation, this is reality. Now, in responding to all of this, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the Schiller Institute leader, said, here's the real question. The key question is to get popular support from the majority of the world population to express that they are concerned about World War III, that they won't go along with World War III. You have an opportunity in the days and weeks ahead to be part of that expression of rebellion against this unipolar order, which is propelling the world toward war and chaos. There are demonstrations coming up all over the Western countries. On February 18th, an anti-war rally in Munich, which will be protesting the opening of the Munich Security Conference. It was a few years ago at this Munich Security Conference that Zelensky called for the West to give Ukraine nuclear weapons to be able to combat Russia. February 19th, there's the Rage Against the War Machine rally in Washington, D.C. There are companion rallies to build this in Los Angeles on February 18th, Mexico City, February 19th. There's a demonstration in Austin, Texas, February 23rd. And there are also demonstrations set for Berlin, Rome, and cities in France the weekend of February 25th and 26th. And you can have your own anti-war rally. What's important is that the people speak out. The only thing that will stop the war machine is a growing mobilization of popular support against the war and for the shift from a confrontational, geopolitical, provocational, strategic policy to a new strategic and economic development architecture. That's what we're fighting for. If you support that, join us. I'll see you again tomorrow.